Street apologist. Street apologist. Street apologist. Whoa, on the radio.
Welcome to Street Apologists Radio, ladies and gentlemen. My name is VOCAB MALONE. We are live. Today is a Thursday. The date is January 10th, 2019. Tonight, imagine that you're actually in seminary with us. And imagine that the class in seminary is going to be a class where the professor wants to try to reconcile the ever-classic challenge of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. We're going to look at one option that we're not necessarily buying. However, we got respect for the people who hold it and want to do a critique in a friendly and charitable way. While you're getting ready to do that, I encourage you to hit that like button. Smash it, homies. Grab this link, share it, please. We're going to be looking at this, the Oxford Guide to Philosophy. We're going to be looking at this, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. We probably won't get a chance to look at this by John Frame, A History of Western Philosophy and Theology, but boy, I wish we could, because I love John Frame and I love that book. So what's up to the moderator squad in the house? Shout out to the Patreon folks. If you are a supporter of mine on Patreon, be sure to check your inbox, because I just messaged all of you between yesterday and today. All of you got a message, so a special message, and I want you to check it out and respond back if you can, please. Some of you who have already responded, which I do appreciate. It has to do with what we're going to be doing in 2019. Once again, I'm VOCAB MALONE. Some of you know, some of you don't. And I'll be speaking tonight to Tyler Vela, and he's got some great information, and I'm very excited about tonight's show. Very, very excited. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and cut this intro short and introduce on Street Apologist, Tyler Vela. Welcome to the Molinism discussion. Hold on, let me bring your mic up. You're live with me. What's up, Tyler?
Hey, how are you?
All right, so it is Vela, right? I heard you pronounce it, and I thought that's what you said.
Yep, Vela.
All right, man. You're not it's just a guess. You might not be. That's not an Italian last name, is it?
It's not. It's Mexican.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you got second.
Spanish.
You got second best. That's okay.
That's all right.
I'm just kidding, bro. Just messing, bro. Nah, I already knew that, guys. Check it out. My man Tyler is chilling in Cali. He runs the Freed Thinker podcast. The address is right there on the screen. He's done extensive stuff where he speaks about tonight's topic, and he's done debates on the issue as well as done debates with several atheists. He's got a fantastic conference coming up in Waco, Texas, that he's part of with a number of other people that he's in a crew with called the Mentionables, and that's going to be in Waco, Texas. In fact, if you follow me on Instagram at VOCAB MALONE, I posted that today, so I gave information about that conference coming up here in the spring, where we're going to jump right into this topic. But Tyler, real quick, what else do you want people to know about you? For example, we want them to subscribe to your YouTube channel, so give them that information and anything else that's important, and we'll jump right into this Molinism discussion.
Yeah, if you find the Freed Thinker on YouTube or iTunes, that's the best. Or follow the Mentionables, the Mentionable 1 with the number 1 on Twitter to get a bunch of information about that ministry that I'm involved with. So that's about it.
Awesome. And I first saw Tyler when he was speaking with Andrew Rappaport of Striving for Eternity and Matt Slick of CARM, both of whom I also highly recommend. And when I saw Tyler, I said, this is a guy I definitely need to have on. And then I've seen a lot of his stuff since then. Great stuff, fantastic stuff. We don't agree on everything, but then again, no one does. The Genesis stuff, we had different positions on that, but I see what you're trying to do there, bro. So I got love.
Right.
I got love for you. Check this out. Shout out to Lily in the super chat. And since Lily, you're the first to break the ice on that tip, let me break down the rules on that. Here's how it works. 50 in the super chat gets a freestyle at the end of the show, or 100 viewers, which we're almost halfway there, gets a freestyle at the end of the show. So there's two ways to achieve it. Some people like Mark Cleveland hope we don't achieve it. Others like Rox B and Miss Holly and CARM and Michelle Marie, they do hope we achieve it. So with that, I'm going to read this entry about Louis de Molina, and then and then I'll kind of let you begin the discussion. This is from the Oxford Guide to Philosophy, and I'm going to read about Louis de Molina, everybody, and then that's going to be our entry point into the discussion. So after I read this, Tyler, you can kick it off. Louis de Molina, 1535 to 1600, a Jesuit theologian and philosopher, born in Spain. He studied and taught at various leading Iberian universities. Molina is best known for his doctrine of middle knowledge, expounded in Concordia Liberia Arbitrii cum gratia donis, 1588. This doctrine's aim was to preserve human free will while maintaining the Christian doctrine of the efficacy of divine grace. For Molina, although God has foreknowledge of what human beings will choose to do, neither that knowledge nor God's grace determine human will. That's a big key right there. Middle knowledge, God's knowledge of what persons would do under any set of circumstances, enables God to arrange. That's kind of a funny sentence, isn't it, everybody? Enables God to arrange. God's like, thanks for letting me arrange it, guys. Just kidding. But enables God to arrange for certain human acts to occur by prearranging the circumstances surrounding a choice without determining the human will. Again, you notice how that's a key in what Molina was doing. Determining is to preserve an autonomous libertarian understanding of human will. God's grace is concurrent with the act of the will and does not predetermine it. Again, so what God does is does not predetermine it, rendering the Thomistic distinction between sufficient and efficacious grace superfluous. And I would add, lastly, that Molina was a counter-Reformation philosopher, meaning Reformation happened. You got guys like Martin Luther. Hi, I'm Martin Luther. And he was part of a Reformation that took place in Western Europe that led all around the world. And the Catholics said, man, we gotta deal with this on an intellectual level. We can't just drown and kill everybody and excommunicate everybody. We've got to deal with some of the arguments. And so Molina was like, aha. So he thought he had a solution as a counter-reformer. Now, that's the intro. Tyler Vela, why are we talking about this in the first place? You know, this medieval / modern era counter-reformer Catholic philosopher. Why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Largely because while, from what I can tell, Molina's theory didn't have that much of an impact for a really long time, it has seen a resurgence in Christian philosophy and apologetics, largely due to the work of men like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig. And the reason why it has apologetical value and why people think that it's so important is because they believe that it gives one of the strongest, if not the strongest, frameworks to answer, say, a problem of evil from the kind of free will theodicy. And so Molinism is seen of having these kind of theoretical virtues that they maintain libertarian freedom. They get God off the hook for determining sin, evil, all those kinds of things. And then there's some other, secondary or tertiary benefits to it that they would see, but that not all Molinists agree on. So William Lane Craig, for example, sees Molinists as benefiting the question about all the unsaved Mayans during the life of Christ. Why did God create these humans which wouldn't even ever have the opportunity to hear the gospel? But if he desires all to be saved, why even create them? And so he thinks Molinism is going to give him an answer to that.
Well, this is totally irrelevant, but I do like to interact with the live chat. Binto Fernandez says, VOCAB, what can I say? I thought you were good looking, but our man Tyler is wow. You don't have to comment, bro. But
don't know what to do with that. Thank you. I appreciate the man love, I guess.
Everyone, we're just kidding. Now, you said something. You said problem of evil theodicy. Real quick, what's problem of evil theodicy?
So the problem of evil, problem of suffering, is the question about why would God allow evil and suffering? Why would a good God create a world, a cosmos, where there is such a volume of pain, suffering, evil, sin, and a theodicy is an attempt to answer that. And the Molinist, following on the work of Plantinga, Craig, Molina, is going to try to answer, because God was interested in creating creatures who would freely choose him, and there's this unfortunate byproduct of freedom, which is that we abuse our freedom and do terrible things. But they're not open theists. Even though I'm going to argue that I think it entails open theism, Molinists aren't open theists. They want to maintain that God is omnipotent, that God is omniscient, and that he is sovereign over creation. So they don't want to deny sovereignty. They want to try to align those two things, that God is completely sovereign, but man has total libertarian freedom. And so they think Molinism gives that benefit.
What is an open theist, and what's the problem with it?
An open theist is someone who believes that because future facts cannot be... Let me back up. They're going to say that you can't know things that aren't true. And since future facts are non-true, they're not true yet, that God can't know future facts. And so God's knowledge is open. He might know 100% of the possible things that could happen and kind of see where it's going, but he can't know for a fact what the future will contain. So in essence, God is learning with us, although learning might not be the word that they would choose, as creation unfolds.
Nice. Reasonable Faith Indy says, bracing for the worst, hoping for the best.
Yeah.
No, I think what he's saying is, I'm a Molinist. Please be nice, bros.
Either be nice, or hey, you're dealing with a whole bunch of concepts dealing with modality and philosophy. Get it right. That could be another one.
All right, so let's try to get it right. Let's try to get it right here. So,
Yep.
Guys, sort of a summary of what we talked about so far, in all seriousness. The problem evil, which is why does a good God allow bad things to happen, or something like that, is
Yep.
certainly, I think, a respectable and formidable challenge to the Christian faith that the Bible itself deals with. So the Bible must consider it a legitimate question in the sense of it needs to at least be discussed. It recognizes that it is there throughout its pages. Now, within that, Christian theologians and philosophers from those vantage points have tried to answer those questions in various ways. And there's different levels where people say, here's where God's sovereignty comes into play, and then other levels where people say, here's where human free will comes into play, and people have different perspectives on those issues. So within that, we have something now that has seen a resurgence in the last 10 to 20 years within modern theistic professional philosophers, and now trickled down to students and on the internet blogosphere, called Molinism, which presents itself as a middle way between Calvinism and Arminianism philosophies and philosophers and theologians and theologies, which says we are going to base this on middle knowledge, God's knowledge of counterfactuals, then to sort of give what we think is a good, feasible answer, dipping into different philosophical resources to explain properly the problem of evil, as well as other problematic issues, such as how do people who have never heard the gospel end up facing God's wrath, and all of that, which Tyler mentioned that William Lane Craig believes that is a potential benefit of Molinism. In the very beginning, I read an entry on Louis de Molina because he is sort of the fountainhead of Molinism, but the resurgence, I think, primarily owes itself, especially within the evangelical world, to William Lane Craig. But even on the live stream, and I'm not going to mention everybody, but a number of you have mentioned, oh, this guy's a Molinist, this guy's a Molinist. So I see that a number of people are familiar with some of their favorite apologists who are Molinists. And so let me stop right now. We've already said Molinists are not open theists. We believe open theists is a heretical position. We're not saying anything like that about Molinists. Just make sure everyone is clear on that. Number two, we have great respect for the people we're going to critique. We're going to do our best. We're not going to get everything right. This is a quick internet entry into the discussion. Now with that, what is Molinism and why aren't you one, Tyler?
Sure. So you did a pretty good job of identifying what Molinism was. I would make one caveat, because if there's Molinists in the room, they're going to be throwing things at the screen right now that you didn't say this. And that is that middle knowledge is not merely counterfactual knowledge. It's specifically a type of knowledge about counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And so they're going to want to press that point. Well,
can I read this real quick?
Yeah,
absolutely. This is not a full expansive definition. This is just a small one. By the way, Tyler's job, your job is to do the caveat, so you're all good. Here's what Craig and Moreland say in the first edition. Now the new edition is out of their really well-known book. It says this: when we understand that God timelessly knows the things he knows, and that his knowledge of something does not cause that thing to happen, then we have the resource for developing a response to the problem. So this is a decidedly non-reformed or non-Calvinistic way to deal with the problem of evil. Just from that sentence alone, you should be able to discern that. Now let me continue. It's only 2 or 3 more sentences. Still others utilize a notion called middle knowledge. Roughly, God's knowledge of what every free creature he could create would do in every possible circumstance in which they could be placed. And I'm just putting on the book for a second. This has to do with the concept we're going to get into called possible worlds. Continuing on, God's middle knowledge of future free acts does not determine, but rather rests on what those choices will be. This approach is quite promising, but in order for it to be completely satisfying, its advocates must explain just how it is that God could possess such knowledge in the first place. See chapter 27. All right, so just reading a little bit from Craig and Moreland there.
Yeah, which, they tip the hat to what is traditionally the biggest objection against Molinism. So where he says that the Molinists can't just fall back on this idea of middle knowledge, which you and I can critique here in a minute. But they have to say how God could know these things. That's a tip of the hat to the grounding objection, which is a very common objection against Molinism. So a couple of things. We'll get to the grounding objection, and then I'll tell you why, or kind of the different route that I take, because the grounding objection is more of it's kind of a metaphysical objection, but I think there are metaphysical problems with Molinism that a lot of people don't address.
On our first show on this, which is on my YouTube page, just type in Molinism, and there's a show called What is Molinism and Is It Biblical? And in that, Francis Turretin fan, he gets more into the grounding objection, which is probably the most common objection. Yeah. However, Tyler's going to say my objections, this is me paraphrasing Tyler, are more on the metaphysical side than just the grounding objection.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things. I know you covered this in your previous one, but we should just get a couple terms in place so people can even just follow what we're talking about. So in classic Christian doctrine and in Protestant, traditional Protestantism, basically everyone outside of the Molinist camp view God's omniscience as having 2 different types of knowledge, right? You have what's called his natural knowledge, and you have his free knowledge. His natural knowledge is his knowledge that he possesses about himself and necessary facts that are derived from himself. So this is how God knows about his own attributes, his own nature, his own necessity, as well as necessary facts like 2 + 2 is 4, or that there are no married bachelors type of thing. His free knowledge is what God knows about contingent facts, about his creation, what he's decreed to create.
Hold on real quick. Contingent facts, everyone, are facts that necessarily need not be, meaning they are
Correct.
Things that are true that are not necessary. For example, since I have not always existed, it's clear that the universe does not need me to exist. I'm a contingent being. And so contingent facts are things that are dependent upon another fact. They are not necessarily necessary in and of themselves. Go ahead.
Right. So God would know, for example, that on the planet Earth, from the surface during a clear day, the sky appears to be blue. He could have made creation and light function different so that the sky would appear red. That's a contingent fact within the world that he has created. So he knows that. One of the common ways that, because on traditional Christian doctrine, on historic Protestantism, on Reformed Protestantism, one of the ways that we would say God has exhaustive counterfactual knowledge, that he knows what could have been but isn't, is an application of God's natural knowledge. So God knows, for example, that whatever he decrees to be true would be true. He knows that about his own omnipotence and the own efficacy of his decrees. That's a part of his natural knowledge. He also knows by his free knowledge what he has decreed. And so if you kind of put those things together, he knows subjunctive facts like, had I decreed this other world, a red sky world, then the sky would appear red from the face of the earth, right? So we're going to say that God has exhaustive counterfactual knowledge, but we don't invent this whole third category of knowledge to create that. It's kind of the inference from his free knowledge.
Now let's stop right there real quick.
Yeah.
Are there examples of what you just said? We're not saying that you find Molinism in the Bible, but are there examples that especially a Molinist would point to in the Bible where they would say, aha, look, here's an example of the fact that God possesses what we would call middle knowledge. And why you bring that up, let me give everyone what I find helpful, but everyone won't find helpful, but nonetheless, let's share. When I was a kid and I didn't kind of collect specific comics, I just collected almost all comics. I had these set of comics called What If. Marvel would put them out, and it would be like this. What if Mary Jane didn't marry Spider-Man? What if Wolverine was not in the X-Men? What if so-and-so didn't die? What if Thanos didn't, these kinds of things, right?
Right.
And then they would tell this alternate story based upon the what if going the other way. And sometimes you can see historical works of fiction doing this. So what if the Nazis had won World War II, and they'll write a whole book about it. These are works of fiction based upon counterfactuals, meaning things that are not the case, but that could have been the case, and then they proceed to try to follow through. Are there examples of things like that in the Bible?
Yeah, sort of, maybe.
Share. Please share. Please share.
Yeah. The three big examples. So the funny thing about this is, if you've ever debated as a Reformed or a Calvinist person or someone who believes in some version of predestination with someone who believes in libertarian freedom, they're going to point to basically any passage that has someone choosing something and say, see, libertarian freedom in the Bible. And we're going to say, wait a second, all that shows is that people choose things, which as a Reformed person, I agree that they do. It doesn't get you to something like libertarian freedom. So here, some of the major verses are 1 Corinthians 2, 7 through 8.
1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. And I will read it if that's okay with you, which says this. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Explain.
So what this comes across, and we'll read all three, and then I'll kind of come back and say why this isn't middle knowledge. What it appears for the Molinists, or for someone who wants to say that this is counterfactual knowledge, is that God's saying, look, if things had been differently, if they had understood kind of the mysteries of the kingdom, the mysteries of the gospel, the wisdom of God, then they wouldn't have crucified Jesus, right? Because they would have understood who Christ was as God incarnate, and so they wouldn't have committed deicide, right? So that's one where they're going to point and say, see, counterfactual knowledge. Another one,
well, hold on,
which
real
is
quick, Tyler.
Yep.
Help me out, because there's some of the other ones you're going to go to I'm more familiar with. On this one in particular, do they actually think that Jesus would not have been crucified if somehow Pilate knew who Jesus was? Are they saying that actually would not have happened? And if they do, how would they reconcile that with God's eternal plan of salvation? I don't know. I want to stop here for a second and ask you, because I don't know the answer to this.
This is one of the things. Well, the hard thing is this is one of the areas where I just don't think there's a good answer to it on their system. So as charitably as I can, and as much as I can, what they're going to say is that given that context that they were in, the religious leaders and the Pharisees and the priests were in, given that context, let's call it C. God foreknew that they would choose that. They would choose to crucify the Lord of glory, and that's what he wanted for his plan, and so therefore he put them in that situation. And so they're gonna want to be almost to the point that it's necessary that they chose that, but just shy of that. Basically, it was of such a kind, it was of such a situation that they would freely choose of their libertarian freedom to crucify the Lord of glory, and God ordained it that way, even though He didn't predestine it that way. That's about as charitable of an answer as I can give based on what they say. I don't think that works, but I think that's about as robust as they would get.
Is it possible on a Molinistic system that God also actuated the world in which, well, okay, never mind. I'm getting a little. I'm going to get it twisted in my own head. So go ahead with the next one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We'll get to some of those actualizing questions later. So another one, and we'll tie all these three together. These are the three big ones. The other one is Matthew 11:21-24.
Matthew chapter 11, verses 21 through 24. And it goes like this. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes.
Yeah. So, and again, this happens, he repeats it again. If it happened in Sodom, they would have remained to this day. And the idea here is saying, well, there's this counterfactual possibility that had Tyre and Sidon been placed in the context that you're placed in, they would have repented in sackcloth and ash and believed, but you didn't. You're guilty. Woe to you. The other one is 1 Samuel 23:11-13.
Yeah, I think this is the first one that I had heard. What 1 Samuel?
This is the big one. This is the big one. This is when they normally go to. This we kind of did these in reverse popularity.
Oh, okay. No wonder I had. Okay,
yeah.
Gotcha. 1 Samuel 23. Which verses do you want me to read again, Tyler?
You can read. Well, 11 and 12.
Okay. Here we go, everybody. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you.
Right. So this one is an example of that they would say, well, David goes to the Lord and basically says, hey, Saul's coming after me. If I go to the city of Keilah, will the people of Keilah hand me over? And the Lord says, yes, if you go there, they'll hand you over. David doesn't go there. He goes somewhere else. And so what they're going to say is, well, God has this middle knowledge about what the free will decisions of the men of Keilah would have been had David gone there. All right, so those are like the three big verses. Now you have some people like William Lane Craig who's going to say, look, these verses don't establish Molinism. He's going to agree that these texts don't establish Molinism. You're going to have other Molinists that are going to say these do establish middle knowledge, and then you're going to have some who say, well, it establishes counterfactuals. I'm going to say I just don't buy it for any of these. I have a hard time imagining that any of these are trying to make these deep philosophical claims about this unknown until Molina third category of knowledge about God. What seems to be happening to me is simple hyperbole and counterfactual reflection. So I don't have middle knowledge, but I can say something like, if I'm really frustrated with someone and my flesh is really coming out, I can say something like, "What are you, stupid?" If I were to tell this to my dog, even my dog would understand this. Now, am I trying to say that there's another alternate, possible world in which if I actually spoke this to my dog, that my dog would believe it? No, I'm speaking hyperbole. I'm making an emphatic point by making this type of contrast. I don't think it's making the metaphysical claims that they're trying to make. This, I think, is the point very clearly in the 1 Corinthians and in the Matthew passage. The 1 Samuel passage, also, I don't think you need to go into this metaphysical realm. All it takes is for God to know the wickedness of the hearts of the men of Keilah, and that but God knows what He's decreed. Kind of going back to what I laid out at the beginning, the traditional Christian view of omniscience and the Reformed view of omniscience, the traditional Protestant view of omniscience. You don't need it. It doesn't establish this third category of middle knowledge, right? So in the same way that any passage that talks about someone choosing doesn't establish libertarian freedom, it just shows that there's choice. These passages don't establish middle knowledge. It just establishes that we can talk about things in counterfactual ways. And so it in no way establishes middle knowledge. The comeback to that.
I've heard, let me see if this has anything to do with what sometimes people say. Yeah. We'll say, okay, the Bible may not be directly teaching it, but it gives hints toward those directions. And Molinism is so intellectually, philosophically, theologically satisfying that we should maybe hope for it to be true. And what it shows is that it's not directly contradicting the Scripture. And so we're okay with the scriptural data as it is, even if it may be somewhat scant.
Yeah. So that was what I was going to say. The comeback typically is, look, Molinism is so philosophically robust that we wouldn't expect it to be fully orbed in the Scriptures, but it's not contradictory to the Scriptures. Right, it's not drawn from the Scriptures, but it's not contradictory to it either. My comeback to this, and I recognize that this is going to be not satisfactory, especially to our Roman Catholic listeners, but the other ones is that is very much a Catholic way to argue.
And you
about
say
theology.
You say that because it's not based on sola scriptura.
Correct.
Why would you say that?
Yeah, because as Protestants, I think that we should rely on sola scriptura as our primary authority, especially when. And I'm not saying that there's no such things as true facts that are true, in virtue of not contradicting the Scriptures. It doesn't contradict the Scriptures that I'm, sitting in a blue chair either. It's not that things are false just because they're not expressly stated in the Scriptures. But when we're deriving theological doctrines about the nature of God, about God's omniscience, about salvation, because Molinism is going to try to address that question about libertarian freedom and our ability to choose to be saved, those kinds of core theologically driven doctrines, I just can't fathom us deriving those from something outside of the Scriptures, even though it doesn't contradict the Scriptures. I think that it's exactly backwards to go from kind of philosophical tradition to theological tradition to biblical text just not contradicting it, which is how we get things like the perpetual virginity of Mary in Roman Catholicism and the such.
Well, Tyler Vela is just poisoning the well at this point.
That's terrible.
No, but let me read 2 comments. Now, these aren't part of your main presentation, so you've got to do the quick answer on both of these. Ready?
Yeah.
First is 12345 Shushi. They says, I feel if God is truly sovereign, that He could make both Molinism and Calvinism possible. Quick answer, why not?
That can't be possible because Molinism relies on a libertarian freedom, which is an incompatibilistic view of sovereignty and freedom. Calvinism relies on a form of compatibilistic freedom that is determined. So it's like saying God can make a married bachelor. God can make incompatibilism and compatibilism true. They both can't be true.
Excellent. One Way says, sorry, but Molinism makes me think of God eternally gazing into one of these. And then it has a crystal ball emoji. No offense intended.
Yeah. What's up, One Way? I know One Way from other servers. And
what's something nice you could say back?
I mean, he's being a bit pejorative, and One Way, I love you. But if we're going to be fair to the Molinists in the same way we would to Arminians and others, God isn't. He's not before in eternity past. He's not. Looking down the corridors of time. He's not gazing at a crystal ball. He's not. Those kind of commit an error of process where God is kind of going through this process or this procedural thing to decide what to do. So it's a conceptual error to cast it that way. There are other problems with how it's rooted, which we'll talk about. But while it's funny to put the crystal ball, it's probably not conceptually accurate.
It does look cool on there. Okay, last one.
Yeah.
David 1769 says, I'd like to hear Tyler's explanation of Psalm 106:23, which says, therefore he said he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the breach before him to turn away his wrath from destroying them. I don't know if you've heard of that one as well.
I have. So part of this is going to come down to, again, that deals with a counterfactual statement. It doesn't get you anything like middle knowledge or the metaphysics that goes under Molinism, and the way that a traditional Reformed person is going to look at that, like myself, is going to say, well, look, God decrees the ends and the means, right? God not only decrees the outcome, but he also decrees the way that gets there. That's why you get in passages like Jeremiah 18 saying, look, if I've declared this destruction to come on a city and they repent, then I'll relent of what I have declared. Now, does that mean that God is changing his plan, that God has changed his mind, that he hasn't determined what the outcome is going to be? No, it means that God is working through providential means in creation. And so the same thing I would say is happening there in the psalm.
Excellent. And I'm going to let you continue on. I'm just going to respond to these real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sushi says, as a Molinist myself, could you guys review 1 Corinthians 2:13? We did that a little bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the beginning of the show. If you would, once the show's done, just rewind and you'll see that miniature discussion right there in the beginning. And then also Eris Toddler, who always has one of my favorite names whenever I see you, bro, says, so what's not satisfactory about compatibilism? Now, I don't know if you're asking us, but Tyler and I would be very satisfied with compatibilism, being compatibilist ourselves. Now, continuing on, sorry for those brief detours. I think you were starting to deal with some metaphysical objections to Molinism.
Yes.
Is that where you were? Okay.
Yeah. So let me get one more objection out of the way before we get to the metaphysical objections. And that is a certain rhetorical strategy within Molinism. So I've now run into a lot of people who are otherwise, they're not Molinists. They don't go down the fully orbed, metaphysical Molinism route. They might even say they're Calvinist or Reformed, but they affirm middle knowledge, right? This kind of gets to that question earlier about can God make, libertarian freedom or Molinism and Calvinism true? The problem is, have you ever seen that cartoon of the camel with his nose under the tent?
Yeah, the camel's nose in the tent. And then once that happens, it's all she wrote
the rest
after that.
of it comes through.
Yeah.
Right. The idea is Molinists are, and I'm not saying to say they're dishonest. I don't think they're dishonest, but it's a rhetorical strategy, whether it's intentional or not. Is this idea that if you can just accept middle knowledge, right? A Reformed person can accept middle knowledge, right? The problem is that the way they define middle knowledge is implicitly assumes libertarian freedom. Because you have to remember, middle knowledge is not just that God has exhaustive counterfactual knowledge. It's specifically that God has counterfactual knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which are libertarianly chosen choices that they just haven't made in the actual world.
So help me out on this, Tyler.
Yeah.
Is that definition of middle knowledge, it's sort of got some Arminian or compatibilistic, some libertarian free will assumptions smuggled into that definition of middle knowledge. However, there's an understanding of middle knowledge that I think we as Reformed people can have and share, which is kind of like this. And I've heard you say something along these lines, but correct me, something like this. We see the Bible teaching clearly that God is omniscient, that he is all-knowing. And so there's a certain sense in which we see God's middle knowledge as almost being a redundancy, meaning God knows all things, kind of siphoning off this special category of middle knowledge. For a Reformed person to define it properly, just says, certainly, okay, that's just another way to say God knows all things. But when a Molinist is doing it, sort of what's happening is they're packing things into the definition of middle knowledge, primarily have to do with creaturely free choices or libertarian or perhaps autonomous freedom, that we wouldn't be going there with that. And there's one other thing I've heard you say that was interesting that I think is true too, and you gave an analogy. Now, some people won't even understand this analogy because it gets into other deep theological territories, and it goes like this. if you've ever had a debate, a theonomist, and we are both Reformed, and so we love our theonomist friends, but they play a little trick on you sometimes, and they'll go like this. Well, do you love God's law? Because theonomy, the position entails applying sort of in toto Old Testament law supposedly to modern day law codes. And every Christian should say yes, right? They'll say, well, all theonomy means is love of God's law. You're a theonomist.
Yep.
But theonomy itself is a much greater system than just the simple kind of word or phrase of love of God's law. Similar with middle knowledge. We affirm God's middle knowledge, and it's almost like, well, then you're a Molinist. But something is happening there.
Yeah. There's kind of a semantic bait and switch that's happening.
Right. And it may not even be on purpose. No one is saying that every Molinist does this, and we're not saying it's purposeful just so everyone knows. Hey, shout out to K-Dub. He's got some great resources on his channel about Reformed theology. Subscribe to his channel. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah. So that's kind of this rhetorical bait and switch. So I would actually push you, and I would say I don't even say that I affirm middle knowledge because the language is too confusing. I say that I affirm God's natural knowledge, his free knowledge, and that God is omniscient. And what's entailed by those two categories is that God has exhaustive counterfactual knowledge. Because as a Reformed person, I'm going to say that truth, either whether counterfactuals or of his free knowledge, are grounded. This is where the grounding objection comes in. Are grounded on the decrees of God. Right? So what is true of his free knowledge is because God has decreed it to be true. So his counterfactual knowledge is basically, look, I know what I've decreed and I know what I haven't decreed. I know these aren't true because I know it could be true because I could have decreed them, but I didn't. So it's still grounded in God's own knowledge, his own natural knowledge and his own free knowledge. I don't need to invent this third category of middle knowledge. The grounding objection comes up because the Molinist is going to say, look, in between, and it's why it's called middle knowledge, in between his natural knowledge and his free knowledge, there's this category of knowledge that isn't based on God actualizing the actual. What comes logically prior to God's middle knowledge is the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. It is the libertarian choices of the creatures that comes logically prior to God knowing it. So there's this grounding objection. How can God know what a free creature will do if that free creature doesn't exist to make it yet and make that free choice? Because couldn't that free creature choose other than what God would know? So it's inexplicable. It's ungrounded on why God would have that middle knowledge. There's more robust ways to say it, but that's why I don't even say I affirm middle knowledge because I think there's a grounding problem with middle knowledge that I don't even want to get tangled up with. And I don't think I even need the label to describe God's omniscience. Right.
Interesting. You're sort of cutting them off in the past there. Now, do this quickly if you can, but I'm trying to interact with the chat, and you've been doing great so far. If you're super annoyed by these interjections, then
no, it's fine.
Then just hit me up in Skype and tell me. But Gerard Perry says, so Molinists don't believe that God initiates salvation?
So Molinists aren't a specific soteriological category. So you can have traditionalists who are Molinists, I should say SBC traditionalists. You can have Arminians who are Molinists. I'm not sure how you could have a Lutheran that's a Molinist, but maybe. You could have different views of salvation and soteriology that undergirds Molinism. And there's a gentleman who's, I heavily criticize, but I love the guy, Tim Stratton, is a Molinist, and he basically says, look, it might be the case that Molinism is true for everything up to salvific choices. Maybe it's the case that Calvinism is true with regard to salvation, that the Holy Spirit, irresistibly regenerates the believer at salvation, overrides their libertarian freedom, and regenerates them and works faith in them and brings them salvation. He says maybe I don't think he thinks that's true, but he says, that's one possible way that you can be a Calvinist and a Molinist. The problem is again, under Calvinism, to make the entire system work, you don't have libertarian freedom anywhere. It's not just that the Calvinists don't hold just that libertarian was there until God regenerates you and that he overrides your libertarian freedom. We just have a fundamentally different anthropology of what constitutes freedom of the will.
All right, so you can see, guys, we are getting into the weeds. And so, Tyler, feel free at any time during the broadcast to repeat yourself and redefine things and all that, because I'm following the live chat. I can tell by some of the questions people are tracking, and I can tell others are struggling hearing this for the first time. Hey, just so everyone knows, the way a discussion on Molinism and middle knowledge works, usually speaking, if it's your first time hearing it, you're only going to catch bits and pieces of it. So if you feel that way right now, don't sweat it. But we got to kind of keep on moving because some people have heard this, so we don't want to get too bogged down and repeating ourselves. But just be aware that's how it is. So give yourselves a break if you're feeling that way, and just know, okay, I'm getting introduced to something new. It's stretching me. By the end, I'll have some new knowledge, but I may not know everything about it. So I'm just encouraging everyone. So continue following along. Okay, Tyler?
Yeah.
I'll chill on the interruptions for a second. My man.
All right. So, and the other thing, just to encourage them, if you haven't heard this or you're kind of new to this, it touches on so many things that you're going to have like 1,000 questions about. What about this on the atonement? And what about this for bringing people to salvation? What about this? And what about? There's going to be a bunch of kind of ulterior questions that you could take it. It touches on a lot of things.
All right.
And so some of these questions, even though they're probably not under the scope of what we should talk about here, are very good questions that make sense that you probably should be asking of the view. So going into some of my objections. So I did a whole episode called "The Metaphysics and the Failure of Molinism," where I lay out a whole arrayment of objections to the way they conceptualize middle knowledge and the way that they deal with middle knowledge and their metaphysics. We're not going to be able to get into all of them here. That episode for mine was like an hour and 15 minutes long. I think we only have like 45 minutes left.
I'll throw the link in the live chat though while you're talking. Go ahead.
So there's a couple problems. And sorry, I'm old school. I have paper handouts. You're going to hear rustling of paper. So we kind of talked about a regular grounding objection. One of the problems, there's another kind of metaphysical grounding objection. And that is, like I said, on Molinism, the libertarian free choices of man are logically prior to God's middle knowledge of them. Some Molinists freak out about that because they're not used to being said that way. Most Molinists are fine with it because we don't mean chronologically prior. We don't mean ontologically prior. We don't mean that creatures are actually in existence and making choices before God knows it. But if you think about it, in order to know that X is true, X has to be true for you to know that it's true. It's logically prior to your knowledge of it. In order for God to have this knowledge of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, these libertarian choices, the truth of those libertarian choices has to logically precede God's knowing those things. And so the question comes, this is the normal grounding objection. The question comes, how can God know that? What makes those things true if there's nothing to substantiate them? And how can God's knowledge supervene on those things? How can he know those things? That's the regular grounding objection. I'm going to pose an aseity grounding objection. And I'm going to say hold on.
Yep. We gotta do this. Aseity to me is such an important concept that is not I think talked about or understood enough within Christian apologetics discussions, but I think it would be great if it was. So it's kind of a little bit weird because there's actually a phrase when you speak of God's aseity, which is sort of one of his nature, his attributes or characteristics according to his nature. You can actually say God is a se, S-E, but within that, so because I don't want people to get lost, can you explain what God's aseity entails? What does it mean when you say God's aseity? And by the way, everyone, it's spelled A-S-E-I-T-Y, and you can look it up further if you want. But go ahead, Tyler.
The aseity of God, or God being ase, means that God is in his essence, in his attributes, is not reliant or is not dependent on or is not even conditioned on anything outside of himself. So it's you could think of aseity as in a kind of absolute self-reliance, self-autonomy, self-existence. There's nothing that God's nature is predicated upon. The problem with the aseity of God and Molinism is that if the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are logically prior to God's middle knowledge, that means that God's knowledge is conditioned upon something that is true outside of himself. And so you have an apparent problem for the aseity of God, for God being ase. Now, the Molinist is going to come back and say, well, they're going to, I'm trying to be as charitable as I can. What they're going to want to say is that aseity refers to his essence, but not maybe the specifics of how that essence is held. So they would say something like God is omniscient independently of anything, but the facts that God knows do not need to have aseity attached to them. Right? So, which I'm just fundamentally going to disagree with. Right? So, and they're going to say, well, God knows things about creation. So aren't you saying that creation, facts about creation have to be logically prior to God's knowledge of them? And I'm going to say, well, back up. No, because remember, the thing that makes those facts true is God's own decree. So God's decree is the thing that grounds those things being facts. So God is actually not reliant on the truth of those facts as an outside condition. What grounds his free knowledge is his own decree. And so you don't run aground of aseity even in his free knowledge. I don't know how you escape that on middle knowledge.
I got some interesting comments here about that. I don't know. Do you want to? So Aristotle says, free will demands aseity for human agency. I'm not
sure.
Okay,
He's probably saying, actually say it one more time.
Free will, but it's in quotation marks. It's in scare quotes or air quotes, one of the two. Free will demands aseity for human agency.
Yeah. So. I don't know what he means by that.
I don't either. So Aristotle, if you can help us out, please, on that. We're trying to follow along with you. And Tommy does have a good definition again of aseity, meaning he depends on nothing outside of himself. His absolute total independence. Michelle Marie says God's self-existence. Yeah. So good things there, guys. Now continuing on.
That's one of my objections. And again, what I'm trying to do is not the typical grounding objections. I'm trying to show there are metaphysical considerations that are problematic here. And I'm going to try to do some of the easier ones to start off with and kind of ease in to the more challenging ones. One of the other problems that I have metaphysically is that Molinism seems to create a condition where you have the existence of gratuitous evil. You have the existence of non-redemptive facts. You have to remember, Molinism is created, or not, maybe not created, but is capitalized on in apologetical circles because of its utility in answering the problem of evil and suffering. Right, so God is kind of off the hook. Libertarian freedom is maintained, and so we're responsible for our own evil. Evil exists as an outworking of our freedom. And they're going to say, look, God doesn't want it to be that way. God doesn't want the rapist to rape the child, but libertarian freedom is of such a good that God wanted to create a world of free creatures where they could freely choose God. And one of the unfortunate consequences that comes out of that is the abuse of freedom. Okay.
So this is in a way part of what people sometimes call the free will defense, I think.
Yes.
Which is, for example, Plantinga is a famous proponent of at least the possibility of a free will defense, and that's what's going on there.
Yeah. I mean, besides the fact that I don't think free will is a good enough explanation to overcome evil, because I can think of very easy counterexamples where we all the time violate people's freedom, and it's a good thing to stop them from doing horrible things. And if God really didn't want the evil to happen, it seems like even if he gave libertarian freedom, stopping people from abusing their freedom in grotesque ways would still be a good thing to do. So I don't even think that defense works. But what it does, if you create Molinism, where God, looks at the feasible worlds that he can create, and we'll get to feasibility in a minute because that's one of my bigger objections. if you look at the feasible worlds that God could create, and he says, look, I'm gonna do the best with the hand of cards that I've been dealt. I'm gonna play the best hand that I can play. But there's these evils that I don't want to happen, but I'm going to work them into my system. But they're unavoidable, right? I can't create a perfect world. There's not a feasible world for me to create that's a perfect world with this many, free agents where they would freely choose. So I'm stuck with this level of evil. It seems entirely self-serving and somewhat ad hoc to say that God can't create a perfect world. He's stuck with these evils. But every single feasible world is the type where God can somehow work all those evils for good. Why is that the only type of feasible world? Why would we say, well, there's no feasible world in which he can work together every single evil for the good of those who love him? Right? If we can just arbitrarily say that there's no such feasible world where every single person freely chooses to believe him, but God can work everything out for his good. He can work everything to his plan. Why can't we just as much in kind of an arbitrary ad hoc way say, well, maybe there's no feasible world where God can work every single evil for the good of those who love him. Maybe there are just truly gratuitous evils, and that's unavoidable. That's part of the hand of the cards that God has been dealt.
And it is the case that Dr. William Lane Craig, for example, has said something like God must play the hands he's been dealt. And so I think there's sort of a rhetorical question people might ask. It's like, who exactly is the card dealer?
Right. Which, I mean, if we're fair to them, that's not the most fair question.
Right.
Because they're going to say, well, God is the card dealer. It's his own logical constraints that constrain the types of cards that he can deal to himself, right? And if God doesn't like the hand, he can, scratch all the cards, and he can create a fully deterministic world however he wants.
And that is where he's, I don't know what the proper terminology is, or help me out, surveying or something like that, possible world scenarios and actuating one. How would they describe God's activity of? Because I know they probably wouldn't like it when someone says he's running the numbers or he's acting as a super calculator, supercomputer, or an accountant or a being, anything like that. I'm saying these are sort of pejorative ways. Sometimes, what is a proper Molinistic way at this sort of stage? Again, I'm trying to find the right words here, and I think you understand my struggle.
Yeah.
To what is he doing exactly as he looks at possible worlds? What's happening in that place?
Yeah, I think even Molinists struggle with this, and that's why you'll often hear them caveat their language. So they'll say things like, well, God looks at all the options that are before him, and then they'll caveat and they say, well, we shouldn't think of this as like, he's actually looking and learning every single, we're stuck in time, and so our language is very linear, chronological language. That's just the defect of how we conceptualize and think about things. We should be fair to Molinists and say when they say that God looks at these, they don't actually mean that he's surveying them, but they should be fair to us when we say God surveys. They shouldn't say, oh, well, that's a mischaracterization. Okay, we're talking about it in the same way that you're trying to talk about it too. We all have the same struggle of trying to take process and procedure out of our language. We all get this thing where we talk about, well, what was God doing before creation? Oh, well, there's no such thing as time. It wasn't before creation. Okay. We all know what we mean. Let's just be fair and charitable with each other. But yeah, so kind of before creation, what he's doing under Molinism, he's saying he's looking at all the worlds that he could feasibly create. And again, we'll get to that distinction here in a second.
Is that where sometimes people use the language of actuate?
Yeah. So he will actualize. We don't even want to say the best of all possible worlds because that's a specific idea in philosophy. He's going to create the world that's the greatest for his desired outcomes.
Okay. So now here's the question. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that some Molinists have different views about what God's greatest desired outcome is. I think the William Lane Craig version, which not everybody holds to, is something like he's going to end up actualizing the possible, now it later becomes actual, world in which the most or the greatest number of free creatures freely choose him.
Correct.
And that's the one he actualizes. But everyone doesn't agree with that. Now, one question we would ask specifically to the Craig version is something like, doesn't it appear that God's greatest good is his own glory? Not that that necessarily runs at odds with the other, but that seems like number one and other things are secondary.
Yeah.
But help everyone out with sort of what's going on there about, well, what is God's greatest goal in the first place? Because that has to do with the telos of the possible world you would actualize.
Yeah. So, as Reformed people, we're going to say, what is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is glorify God and enjoy him forever, right? So we think that God's glory is his number one prime objective, and we could point to scriptures throughout that. Right. Those like William Lane Craig, you're right, are going to say, well, the maximum number of people coming to salvation is God's is kind of the I don't know if he'd say it's the main goal, but it's the biggest one that we're concerned about in apologetics, is what he would say. You do have other Molinists who are going to agree with us a little bit more and say, well, it's not all about the salvation of the most number of people. It is primarily about God's glory, but the chief way that he does that is through bringing people to salvation. So the more people to salvation, the better. And we'd agree with that, right? So, they're not going to agree. Although I think we're all kind of pointing in the same direction. I think even we would agree with William Lane Craig. We're pointing in the right direction. Getting the most people saved is one of the best ways that God shows his glory the most in his grace, even though, as Reformed people, we're going to say, hey, God gets glory in his wrath too. God creates the vessels of mercy and he creates the vessels of wrath.
And so within that, this is just something to take note of for me. That means if you say, hey, I'm going to be a Molinist, one thing you need to be okay with or comfortable with is the fact that there's a reality that there's certain worlds God could have actualized in which certain evil acts never happened, and some people would have been saved.
Right.
But those aren't the worlds that he ended up actualizing, meaning there could be a possible world in which God actualized in which 9/11 happened. Now, I bring that up not because, we're Reformed, so we have certain perspectives on this, but just to kind of make the potential Molinists aware of that reality, I guess, is something that I would point out to them. But continuing on. Yeah.
One of the other things leading into that is William Lane Craig has this view. He thinks one of the benefits of Molinism is that it explains this problem of the unevangelized, right? The Mayan living in the Mexican Peninsula before or during the time of Christ. They have no hope of the gospel, and he's going to say, well, those are people that have what's called trans-world depravity, that they wouldn't believe, that they would be depraved in any situation, any context that you put them in. And so he kind of takes them all, puts them in these locations, kind of, they wouldn't believe in any context anyway, so we don't have to worry about it.
I always laugh at that phrase, trans-world depravity. On our previous podcast, and my man Reasonable Faith Indy, who wrote a critique of that, which I told you, hey, bro, you can feel free to drop that in the live chat if you want. I had made a joke that the New York Jets were trans-world losers in every possible world. The New York Jets.
I agree.
And people seem to like that. I don't know. But so continuing on.
So this one has a couple metaphysical problems for me. The first one is it has this idea that humans are kind of these little static things. It's almost, what is it? Is it Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses that think, where there's this like bank of souls that God just draws from and then puts you in your
Mormonism.
History?
They call them intelligences. Prior to them being incarnated, their intelligences in heaven, and then God gives them bodies, and then their memory, like Men in Black, from their intelligence existence, the pre-existence is wiped out. But so I mean, obviously all that nonsense the Molinists aren't going to affirm, but it's almost this idea of no matter what the context is, God could place them anywhere in history, in any possible world, any situation, and they wouldn't believe, right? That's trans-world depravity. Every possible world, they would be an unbeliever. I just think that's a very unbiblical anthropology. And philosophically, I don't think it makes sense. I don't know what it means to say, I don't even think that in another possible world that I would even be me, right? If you put me in a different culture, a different place, a different time, to different parents, different genetics, I don't even know in what sense that I am the same person
that you're moving around. And unless we have this weird concept that our souls are, our souls are a spirit of these little tabula rasa things that God can move around in time and history, which I just think is a very unbiblical concept that kind of undergirds that. The other problem with it is, logically, if there are these trans-world depraved people, and it seems like there could be a nearly infinite number of those because there's a nearly infinite number of iterations. Once you start approaching infinites, anything has a nearly infinite amount of those things. You also would have a nearly infinite number of trans-world righteous people that would believe in any context. So why couldn't God take that nearly infinite number of trans-world people, instead of populating them in Mayan culture, put them all over the world so that they believe in any context, in any situation? And then you have this whole world of populated believers and righteous people. It seems entirely special pleading to kind of allow for one side of the coin to explain something, but not the exact, logical contrapositive on the other, to allow for that.
Contrapositive. That's a new word.
Sorry.
I've never heard of that. Contrapositive. Yeah. So I like that. Go ahead. Sorry.
I don't see why we should allow for one and not the other. So that's a problem. That not all Molinists take that position of transworld depravity. So that doesn't apply. That's not kind of Molinism qua Molinism. That's kind of an offshoot of a Molinistic denominational view, if you will. So that's that. Those are kind of the quick and dirty metaphysical problems. I haven't heard great responses to them. There might be good responses to them that people could work on. I haven't heard good ones. My main two objections, metaphysically speaking, to Molinism. The first one is this idea, and I said we get to it, is this idea of feasibility. So what the Molinist is going to say is that there's what's called strictly logically possible, something that is strictly logically possible. It's logically possible that there is a world in which every single person ever freely chooses to believe.
What that means, everybody, is
possible.
There's nothing specifically logically contradicting the idea that there could be a possible world which every person believes. Like, there's nothing that contradicts the laws of logic. Whereas if we said, hey, look, here's a world in which there are square triangles holding the same definitions that we understand a square and triangle, okay? Mm-hmm. Here's a world in which square triangles exist. That's logically impossible. That's not even a possible world. There's a possible world in which humans could swim 50 miles an hour for 5 hours. It's not logically impossible. Now, in the current constraints of physics and physicality, that's physically impossible in this world, but it's not logically impossible in any other given world. I'm trying to flesh that out, hopefully not making a mess of it in the process.
A little bit, actually. The swimming one is a good example, because that could be a feasible world. God could have created us with the ability.
That's what I was saying. There's nothing logically impossible, but in this current world, it's physically impossible.
But they're going to say there are logically possible worlds that still aren't feasible for God to create, and they're going to say,
well, hold on. How do they know that?
Well, this is why when you talk to a Molinist, and they're going to say, and you say, okay, well, isn't it possible that God could have created a world where everybody believes? They're going to say, well, that's a logically possible world, but it might be the case that in any world with sufficiently free creatures and a sufficient number of us, that there is no feasible world where God could create where everyone would freely choose, because given human freedom, it's possible that someone would freely choose to disbelieve. Okay. I find that explanation baffling and bizarre. Typically, when we're talking about feasibility, your example of the human swimming was excellent for a very specific reason. When we consider feasibility, things are infeasible because there are certain limiting factors. Right? So it's logically possible in this world for me to swim 50 miles an hour for 50 minutes, especially if God is omnipotent and can make me do that.
Right.
But it's not feasible outside of a miracle of God because of the conditions that God has already instituted within creation.
Right. There is
Right?
one exception. If your mother was an Atlantean and your father was a human, it's possible you may be able to do it, a la Aquaman.
Why you got to out my
So
identity,
I'm
man?
just kidding. Go ahead, Arthur. I mean, Tyler.
That's all right. If I was going to pick a superhero, it wouldn't be that one. So they're going to say, well, that's the difference between possibility and feasible. So it might and this is where you get when you hear William Lane Craig and others, they're going to say, well, it might be the case that given creaturely freedom, that you couldn't God couldn't create a world like that. All right, I have massive problems with that. Not only before creation, God hasn't instituted any constraints on creation yet. He hasn't selected which individuals to create in that world. There's no constraints on what is logically possible for God that would make some logical possible worlds infeasible for him to create. And it seems to me that any attempt to do that, any attempt to say, well, it might be the case that is arbitrary and it's ad hoc to save the Molinistic scheme. Because I could say, well, it might be the case that there is a possible world where that is feasible. I mean, we just get into, well, it might be the case, a battle of it might be the cases. And you can't move from it might be the case to it is the case that Molinism does. So there's a modal fallacy that happens there as well.
Hold on, there are a couple of things to define. When you say
Yep.
arbitrary and ad hoc, define those and explain why they're problematic, because you're leveling those concepts rather, as a critique.
Yeah.
Just break that down real bite-size if you could.
Yeah. So an arbitrary distinction is one that you're making in a way that is not necessary. Right, you're just kind of making it. It's ad hoc. You're making it because you need that to be made to make your thesis true. There's no reason to make it other than it makes your thesis true.
Okay. Now, what about ad hoc? Go with that.
So ad hoc is that you're making an alteration to make your thesis true. So it's not just you're making an arbitrary distinction. You're making one in an ad hoc manner, specifically just because you need it that way to make your thesis true.
And so everyone, when something's ad hoc, it doesn't necessarily have prior explanatory power. It's sort of after the fact given
Right.
to make it all work out.
Right.
Now, what about you said modal? Now I just forgot what you said. Modal objection? Hold on.
A modal fallacy.
Yeah, can you explain that as well, please?
A modal fallacy is when you invalidly distribute what's called a modal operator. Modal operators are things like might, contingently, could be, possibly, into, things of certainty is, necessary, things like that. So if you move from it may be the case that, and since it may be the case, therefore it is the case, that's a modal fallacy. You've invalidly moved modal operators. And there's no reason without a valid reason to do so. There's nothing that moves the modal operator from kind of a potential modality to a necessary modality or true modality.
Now, this verse may not be relevant to what you're saying. Help me out. I don't know if it figures into the discussion. It's something I always think of when I hear about this. It's Exodus 4:11, where Yahweh says to Moses in response to Moses saying, "Hey, I don't really talk really well." And Yahweh says this. And the reason why this seems relevant to me is because it seems as if it's showing that God assigns the characteristics in the first place. Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" And the reason I bring that up, it seems like God goes beyond just allowing people to be in different circumstances and sort of then they choose their own adventure. Mm-hmm. It seems as if the very characteristics of the operators or agents in the system or the world, he's the one assigning, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, the Molinist would agree with that. The Molinist is going to say, well, God foreordains things. God is sovereign over things because He determines the condition and the context. So it might be the case that if God puts you in this certain circumstance, I think you guys used the Matrix in your last show. If God puts Neo in this certain circumstance, He's going to choose the red pill. And God's plan needs Neo to choose the red pill. So He's going to put him in that context, where maybe in a different context, he wouldn't choose the red pill. And so God's going to choose the circumstance under which Neo will choose the red pill, but he'll freely choose it based on his libertarian freedom. So that's how they're going to they would agree with that verse, basically.
Okay.
The problem, though, is that you'll hear them say things like, well, if you want to affirm omniscience, if you want to affirm that God, knows all counterfactuals, the most that he can know, you should affirm middle knowledge and Molinism. I'm going to say, well, here's the problem. God, I'm going to say, under a Reformed view, God could have decreed let's call it, the absolute saved world, where every single individual is saved. He could have decreed that, and thus God could have the counterfactual knowledge. If I created the universal saved world, then all people would have chosen to believe in me, right? The Molinist is going to say, well, that world isn't feasible, and so God can't have that aspect in his middle knowledge. So I'm going to say, well, under Molinism, then God knows less things than he does under a traditional view or a Protestant view or Reformed view. And they're going to say, well, that's because that's not a possible thing for God to know. That's fine. But they need to give a reason why God can't know that. Because imagine that God knows, if I created this world, this all saved world, that all people would freely believe, the Molinist is going to come and say, well, the reason why God that's not feasible is because in that world, it might not be possible that all of them would freely believe. And so the only way to say that God can't feasibly create that world is to say, well, God can't know that, because if he created that world, it might be the case that someone would freely choose to disbelieve in him. But what they've done is they've said, if God, let's just call that world W, if God has created W, it might be the case that world is not W, which just shifts the goalposts, right? Then all they've said is that God can't create W because it might be not W, which just makes no sense, right? If God can create W, then he has foreknowledge, he has absolute foreknowledge, omniscience about the facts of world W. You can't get around it by saying, well, W might have some features that are not W, because then you're shifting the concepts. Then you're talking about a different world that isn't that possible world. I know that's kind of confusing. That's a lot of kind of detailed modal logic, but that's one of the problems with trying to argue infeasibility.
Now, what about this? I've heard you say this before, and I found it novel in the sense of I hadn't heard anybody raise it before. Could you explain it maybe, and then its relevance? If hopefully this isn't taking you too far afield, but it's from your own prior interviews. Mm-hmm. You said in one place, imagine if this is sort of to the Molinists, asking them to do a thought experiment. Mm-hmm. Imagine, if you will, a possible world in which everything is exactly identical, save except for one fact. Someone thinks a thought, and so they have an abstract concept, but it doesn't result in any action or any other change in the world. And I think I'm explaining it right, and if not, help me out. Then what is the reason for why then God actualizes one world over the next, at least even between those two? Right. Could you help flesh that out? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another lead into this. Let me give the preface to that thought experiment. The thought experiment is, imagine you have a button in front of you. All right. And you know that if you press the button, someone in the world, however it works out, is going to freely choose to murder someone. Let's ignore the metaphysics of it somehow making someone to freely choose something. Let's just ignore that for now. It causes someone to freely choose to murder someone. All right. If you press the red button. If you press the green button, it causes the same person to freely choose not to murder someone, right? And you have to press a button. You can't abstain. The world will come to a collapse and a screaming halt if you don't choose a button. I don't know. You have to press one of the buttons. The question is, if you press one of the buttons, even under the contingency that person's choice is free, right? Because maybe it's through you're setting the context, you're weekly actualizing it, whatever it is. If you press one of those buttons, are you causally determining? Are you deciding what will be true in the actual world, even though the person's going to freely choose it? The answer is obviously yes. You are a causal condition that's determining what course of action the world is going to take.
And so I think this relates to something else that
Mhm.
seems problematic, because I think it's a problem Molinists wanted to avoid. Once God actualizes any given possible world, everything is set in concrete. It's immutable. It's unchangeable. The course is set. So it appears like there's sort of a back end micromanaging that it seems like the Molinists by and large wanted to avoid, but yet because of the fact that now it's there, it all is, we can now do no other, which seems like, again, something they want to avoid. But I understand they find the end around satisfying. Yep. And so I understand to an extent, but on the other hand, I don't. Again, maybe you can do it more deftly than that.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the thought experiment that you were bringing up, because that button is a conceptual, that idea is a conceptual precursor to the thought experiment. So now let's imagine that God has, I'm going to use process language. I'm sorry to the Molinists listening. We don't actually think that God throws through this process. God has kind of surveyed all the world. He's narrowed it down to two possible worlds that he could feasibly create. There's world 1 and world 2, and they're identical in every single possible way, with the exception of at T1, which is just the philosophical way of saying it, at this given time, at T1, VOCAB is going to freely choose to believe an abstract thought that pops into existence and out of existence and has no ramification on any other fact of creation, either before or after, right? I'm trying to, under the thought experiment, I'm allowed to get rid of the butterfly effect. In W2, VOCAB freely chooses to suppress that belief, right? So in the only difference between world 1 and world 2 is what you decide. You either freely decide to have this belief or to suppress this belief. That's the only difference. It has no other ramifications whatsoever. God's narrowed down his actualization. He's going to actualize either world 1 or world 2. If God actualizes world 1, is he causally determining the truth of the propositional fact that VOCAB will at T1 freely choose to believe that fact? Or if he actualizes world 2, is he causally determining the truth of the fact that VOCAB will freely suppress that belief at T1? The clear answer is obviously yes. That is a causally determinative condition, right? And that's for a non-consequential. You extrapolate that out to anything. The idea is that once God surveys, the instant that God actualizes a world, he has now entered into causally determining the truth proposition of that world as opposed to any other possible world. So creation is an act of causation.
It looks like actualizing is the kissing cousin of ordaining or determining.
They want it to seem that way. But what it actually is creation just is a causal act.
So you're saying they're not kissing cousins, they're identical twins.
Yes. Yep.
All right. I'm just trying to, all right, now, Tyler, here's what we got to do. If you got one more thing in you, now I know you have more than one more thing in you, kind of get it out there, because I want to see if it's okay pretty soon to turn to the live chat. And we've got an excellent audience. Like, I'm pretty impressed, first of all, with how they're conducting themselves. Props to everyone, because we have plenty of people disagreeing. Guys, keep it how you are right now. The way you're behaving, the live chat is so exemplary, however you say that word. And I do want to answer some questions once we kind of get this out. And then, by the way, Tyler, I am sorry to inform you that at some point at the end of the show, I do have to freestyle because we achieved our goals. And so that's
as long as I don't have to do it.
You don't have to, but you could give me some of the concepts. But go ahead.
Right. I'll give you words like, infralapsarianism and stuff.
All right, we could do that. So land the plane so we can then take questions.
Okay. The last one that I would give is this question of once God has actualized a world, right? So he has his middle knowledge, he has his free knowledge of the actual world, because they want to affirm libertarian freedom. Am I able to freely choose to act contrary to what God foreknew? The reason why this becomes a problem, they're going to say, well, no, because they're going to say yes, but God would have known that that's how you would have acted. The problem is that by God's foreknowledge, under this scheme, God actualized a world knowing, again, let's go back to that vocab at T1, would freely choose to believe some proposition, right? The question is, once we arrive at T1, providentially through redemptive history, we've gotten there. If you have libertarian freedom is the ability, conditionally and categorically, to do otherwise. If you have that ability, nothing has conditioned you. If we rewind the tape, if you choose to believe it in one, if we rewind the tape and start over, are you going to make that same thing, that same decision 1,000 out of 1,000 times, 1,000,000 out of 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 out of 1,000,000,000 times? Or is there a possible world where you would freely choose, because nothing determines your choice, to believe otherwise? They can't say yes and God would know that, because what that does is, again, it shifts the goalposts. They're going to say, if God has actualized world one, it's because he foreknew at T1 you would freely choose to believe. They can't say, well, yes, at T1 you could freely choose to not believe, and God would foreknow that would have been your choice. Because now they've shifted what God's foreknowledge was prior to creating W1, right? Before creating world one. They can't do it that way. So they're stuck either saying, no, you can't freely choose otherwise, or if they want to say you can, but you never will, but it's possible that you could, what that means is, in principle, it's possible for you to choose something else that God didn't know that you would choose. The reason why that's extremely problematic, and this is, by the way, why I say Molinism entails open theism. I don't think it is open theism. I don't think Molinism proper is heretical. I don't think Molinists are heretical, but I think it has this logical entailment that opens itself to open theism. Because what happens, in principle, at T1, you could choose to do something other than what God happens. There's a category that is open where God's foreknowledge could be wrong. And that's specifically the type of thing that God can't know, because it just is the thing that God can't know. So what happens then is, even if God is right 100% of the time, even if he never fails to be wrong, he can't know that he's going to be right. Because he can't know the instances where he won't be right. He can't know where the landmines would be, right? It might be the case that this next action is where we choose something libertarian other than what God foreknows. Now, again, maybe God's right 100% of the time, but what happens is that every single one of these instances, the fact that God was right is being confirmed to God. God is learning that he was right, which is open theism.
It seems like I could see them saying something like, you're equivocating on the concept or what that phrase means. I don't know. I'm trying to think how they would sort of respond. But someone just asked, Tommy, is there an intro to this stuff I can watch? Yes, there is, and it's on my channel, and I just dropped it in the live chat. So excellent stuff. Now I'm going to turn to the live chat. I had one person say that the stream is pausing. I have not got any indication on my end of any pausing either from myself or Tyler. So someone else let me know if anyone else is having that problem. I've only heard one person say that, so I don't think so. It might be on your end, whoever said that. First question from Renee. How do Molinists reconcile the usage of personal pronouns? The Son gives himself distinct from the Father. Oh, Renee, I know you just came in. You are thinking of modalists.
Yep.
Sorry, I wouldn't have read that if I thought that. Hey, let's just do this because this is kind of funny. Now, again, this is the quick part, right? Vishal, who just now is joining us, says, what's this topic about? Tyler, what's this topic about tonight?
Molinism. Molinism.
What is Molinism? Quick.
Molinism is the idea that God determines which world to actualize based on his knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom.
Loris K. Psalm 25, in response to your last objection, said, Tyler, it's a category fallacy. And following that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Sushi says, isn't this also a possible issue for Calvinism?
So you would have to hash out how it's a category fallacy, because I don't think that it's a category fallacy. So you would have to, that doesn't make me right. It could be a category fallacy. You'd have to hash it out. You can't just say it's a category fallacy. You'd have to hash it out. Feel free to try. I don't see how this is a problem for Calvinism, because on Calvinism, we are compatibilistic. We have no problem saying that God has actually determined and decreed all things whatsoever comes to pass. He declares the beginning from the end. Which, by the way, vocab reminds me, really quick plug, not for something, but we were going to talk about also one of the reasons why we disagree with Molinism is precisely because not only do we think that Molinism isn't derived from the scriptures, we think that the scriptures clearly teach the sovereignty and determining action of God in all things. So not only would they need to overcome some of these philosophical objections, they would have to give better exegetical arguments for passages like Ephesians 1, Romans 9, and a whole host of other ones.
Right, excellent. Roxby says, what would be a good book to learn about Molinism, not from a differing viewpoint? Now, could we recommend one that has multiple viewpoints? What's the Four Views book that has Molinism in it? And I think Paul Helm interacts with William and Craig. Is it Four Views?
Yeah, Divine Knowledge, Four Views.
Divine Knowledge, Four Views. That's one I would recommend. And one as a critique I would recommend is the one you told me about yesterday. What was that book called? Because I just bought it on Kindle, by the way, and I'm reading through the chapter called Molinist Gunslingers. Yep. What's that book?
It's Calvinism and the Problem of Evil.
And then
it's a multi essay book.
And then what's a great book if someone says, okay, what about a Molinist advocate? What's a book you'd recommend for that?
You can read William Lane Craig's book, The Only Wise God, or John Lang. It's Laing, has a book called Middle Knowledge, Human Freedom, and Divine Sovereignty that spells it all out.
Excellent. You're doing great on these questions. Quick. Michelle Marie says, not only is middle knowledge unnecessary to an all-knowing, all-decreeing God, but the Molinist conception of free will makes it impossible for God to exercise providential control over creation. You say?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I actually take a harder line than a lot of people are comfortable with. I don't think libertarian freedom is even logically possible, and I don't think that God even possesses libertarian freedom. So I think that when the Molinists or the Arminian or anyone actually says that we have this kind of autonomous human freedom, creaturely freedom, I actually think they're arguing that we are more free than God could even be.
And are you saying that because God's nature constrains himself? Is that why you're saying that?
Correct. So I think while God is not determined by anyone outside himself, which is part of libertarian freedom, I think that he still is. So, for example, God is not able to lie. God is not able to sin.
Which the Bible literally says. It says, and it also says he doesn't tempt nor can be tempted by evil. So, God, by the way, guys, this is a quick apologetic note. When someone tries to trick you with, can God do anything? Because they always have a reason if they're doing this on purpose why they ask that. The answer technically is no, because he can't contradict his own nature. Now going on to Daj, Mitch.
Well, really fast before you go on to that one, can I give another little apologetical slight that's fun on that one? Because sometimes the skeptic or the atheist who poses that to you is going to say, well, can God do anything? And if you say, well, no, because even the Bible says he can't lie, they're going to say, oh, well, you're redefining omnipotence to get around these problems. And I say, okay, well, great. Let's not quote unquote redefine it, even though that's the historic way it's been defined. Let's how do you want to define it? That God can do anything, that he's not constrained by logic? Right. Great. So what's your objection? Well, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift? Yes. Well, then he can't lift it, but he can.
Yeah, because of how they just defined
You've just given that he can do anything, not even constrained by logic. So God could actualize contradictory states. Great. If you want to define it that way, go nuts. God could do anything.
And
then.
One thing, everyone, just so we understand, God acts in accordance with the laws of nature, but not because they sit over here outside of himself, because the laws of nature are a very reflection, and I speak somewhat loosely, of his very mind, meaning the way God thinks and the way he is where we get the foundation of the laws of logic in the first place. So it's not like he's obeying something else that says you must be this way. Daj Mitch says, God is outside of time, so does foreknowledge even make sense?
Yeah, so again, this is where again we just have trouble with human semantics. We are time, we are tensed beings, and so the way we talk about things is time. So even though foreknowledge means before knowledge in a temporal sense, again, we can go back to, logical priority, prior to creation, whatever that quote unquote prior means, logically prior, metaphysically prior, causally prior. We don't necessarily mean temporally prior.
Excellent. 12345 Sushi, who I believe from the comments, I would guess is a Molinist, says, great stuff, VOCAB and Tyler. You guys are really knowledgeable, and I appreciate your consistency in understanding this position while being charitable and not dividing and calling it heresy. That's good. Yeah, we think it's an overreaction. Oh, I'll speak for myself. I think it's a bad overreaction when Reform folks would call Molinism heresy. I think that's a bad overreaction. Sean Kelly says, what's Tyler's take on Adam's will before the fall as to its nature?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate even in Reform circles.
Yes.
So some people are going to say, well, Adam is the only person that had libertarian freedom. But if you remember, I said I don't think libertarian freedom is even possible in a world that God has actualized, because he's pressed the button. It's determined. So what I would say is that Adam is, in the Latin terms, he's posse peccare, posse non peccare. He's able to sin, able not to sin. But that still, given his nature that God has given him, given the desires that God had placed in him, given the context and the wife that God is in, the serpent that was in there, given all of that stuff, Adam still chose based on, this is an Edwardian term, based on his greatest desire. And so he still freely chose. He still made the choice, but it was in a compatibilistic sense under the determining plan of God.
Excellent. And by the way, everybody, he's referring to Jonathan Edwards when he said that. Tommy says, Tyler, do you have any debates I can watch? I think he specifically means on this topic, which you do. Tell people about those.
I do. So if you go to freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com, which I think is on the screen already, I have a link that is the collection of my stuff on Molinism. I actually have two debates that I did back to back. One of them with Eric Hernandez, pretty famous Molinist, and another one we did a 2-on-2 debate between with myself and Owen Pond, with Eric Hernandez again, and Johnny Saker. So I have those two debates on there.
Do Molinists believe God can make us impeccable free agents in the age to come? Does he at least think he can pull it off? I don't know if I understand the second part, but I think I understand the first part. Do Molinists believe God can make us impeccable free agents in the age to come?
Yeah, this is a big problem for Molinism. I mean, this is a problem for Christianity in general. Is if I can choose, if Adam, even in his innocent state, right? He wasn't holy, but he was innocent, chose to sin. Why is it that in the eternal state, on the new heavens and the new earth, why is it that we don't choose to sin then? And I think the answer that's given is that we have our glorified nature at that point. We stand in the presence of God. We would have I think we're still indwelt by the Spirit for all of eternity. That aligns all those things. Now,
but God has He's eliminated the desire for us to sin at that point, though.
Yeah, so the question, and I honestly think this is a question for every single Christian theology that believes in eternal life. The question is, why didn't God just start that way? So I don't think that that's a specific problem for Molinism or for Calvinism, or that's something that I think every Christian would need to answer.
And really, we don't know the answer other than because he wanted to do it the way he did it.
I think we have a glimpse of an answer in Romans 9 where he says, look, God made vessels of mercy and vessels of wrath, and what if he did that to display the glory of his mercy, or display the glory, the greatness of his glory to his vessels of mercy? A
challenge. He can't contradict his own nature, even though he created the evil he predestined.
So he didn't. This is where you get into the problem of, is God the author of sin? Mm-hmm. And you get into philosophical concepts of God didn't create evil. God actualized a world and predetermined evil. He determined a world in which, through secondary means and causes such as human will, evil would arise in the world.
Excellent. And Daj Mitch says, so what do we do with the problem of evil now? Now, there's no way you can do the whole thing, but Do you have the quick version of what we do with it?
Yeah, I actually have an episode called Calvinism as an Apologetic, where I go through how a Reformed stance I think is more consistent. I think the first problem is I don't think that there is a thing as the problem of evil, and not in the sense of there's tons of problems of evil. I think the only way that you have a problem of evil is if there is such a thing as objective morality to begin with, and you only have that if God exists. So I don't think there is a problem of evil that undermines the Christian faith in the existence of God, because you only have it if God exists.
But there is something that is paradoxical as we look at it.
Correct.
That is not fully reconciled in this life.
Yep. And I think that's one of the answers there is the answer to the problem of evil is the fact that God gains all his glory, whether or not it's through evil, whether or not it's through good, whether or not it's through mercy, whether or not it's through wrath. All things are for the good of those who love him.
And I think that's part of Paul's exclamation that you find at the end of Romans 11.
Yeah.
Next question, Jake says, how can God hold us accountable for things that he ultimately chose for us? I think I've heard that objection before somewhere.
Yeah, often. Aren't we puppets? Aren't we robots? Aren't we
no,
whatever?
I'm being slightly sardonic in the sense that it's in Romans 9.
Yeah. So this is where I could just give the pure Calvinistic answer and not deal with Molinism and say, well, that objection basically is of the form of, if we can't resist God's will, isn't that unfair? Which really what you've done is you've inhabited the objection that Paul's interlocutor in Romans 9 gives. So you're actually assuming an objection that someone opposes to the teaching of Paul, which, do you want to be in that place? I don't. I'd rather be on Paul's side. The other part of it is, without going too deep into it, is look up Guillaume Bignon's book, Calvinism, Excusing Sinners, Blaming God, or he has a talk on it that's very good. And basically there's an assumption, and there's not enough time to go into this. There are two different types of ability. There's categorical ability, which is the ability to do otherwise, and there's conditional ability, which is the ability to do what you want to do. And the Calvinist is going to say that having conditional ability is required for moral responsibility, but having categorical ability is not required for moral responsibility. And the libertarian freedom, when asking that question, is asking about categorical ability, which we just don't think you need for moral responsibility. Anyways, for more on that, look up Bignon.
Excellent. And Guillaume Bignon's actually, for those who have seen him around before, part of our little circle. What I mean is sort of the Acts 17 apologetics crew, hang out at ETS. Former atheist, has an amazing testimony. Check it out in Christianity Today. But there's a famous video that has nothing to do with any of this on David Wood's channel that is titled How to Annoy a Frenchman, in which they take a road trip in which the whole time David is reciting old school rap songs word by word, line by line, and Guillaume is just sitting there. It's pretty funny video though. Next question is, can you explain how free will is compatible with Calvinism?
Yeah, so, well, it depends on what you mean by free will, right? Because if you mean libertarian freedom, it's not. Libertarian freedom is an incompatibilist system. If you mean the ability to choose, I hold to what's an Edwardian compatibilism. I think we choose based on our greatest desire, but that our greatest desire is determined by our basically nature and nurture. Our nature, my Tylerness, my historical context, my setting, the situation God has put me in, my makeup, my genes, my history, all those things that even the Molinist says God determines the concept, are determinative of what I desire to do. And so I act on my greatest desire. And so I choose based on my greatest desire, but I am still causally determined to choose that. But I'm doing what I want to do. That's the conditional ability. And so I have the freedom to choose what I want, but I'm also equally determined.
So sometimes I know I've seen some people that like the phrase free choice better than free will, because free will a lot of times gets defined as automatically libertarian free will, and Calvinists are okay with free choice but not free will as defined a lot of times at a popular level. Aristotle says Paul's theodicy, unlike modern approaches, sees God's wrath as defending his reputation. He doesn't ask to be exonerated from it. Thoughts on that?
It would depend on what he means by it. Let me pull up the Romans 9 passage. I've heard arguments like this before. My main thing is if you so we talked about this before in our pre-call, is basically I think that apologetics and apologists get things exactly backwards a lot of times. A lot of times we go backwards from what has apologetical value to philosophical to theological to our biblical theology, and we work backwards that way. And I think we should work exactly the opposite direction. If you actually do an exegetical, read through some of the commentaries, the rhetorical analysis of what Paul is doing in Romans 9, I think by the time you reach that section, Paul actually is answering the question which is posed: why does he still find fault for who resists his will? If you can't resist his will, why are you still guilty for it? And he says, the first thing he says basically is, who the hell are you to ask that?
To answer back to God.
Yeah, which is the very Job answer, because some people looked at Job as a theonomy. It's not.
Theodicy. Well, what does molded
theodicy
say to its molder? Why have you made me like this?
Yeah, and the idea is Paul's expounding, saying, look, not only are you not to answer back to God, God has the right to make you that way. He has the right to give you that nature, right? Notice they're from the same lump of clay. They're from the same thing, but one of them is for honorable use. One of them is for dishonorable. This is, by the way, why I get the analogy, but I hate that analogy of, well, God's grace is like the sun, and against wax it melts the waxy heart, and against clay it hardens the heart. They're from the same clay. They're both clay. So why does it harden one from the same lump of clay and melt the other piece of the lump? Right? That analogy kind of doesn't work. The idea is that God gets to take the same nature and he determines whether or not you're going to be for honorable use, you're going to be an object of mercy, or whether you are going to be a vessel of wrath. He determines that,
whether
as the potter of the clay.
Laura Skay says, Molinists do have an explanation of Romans 9, and Reasonable Faith says, how would you compare your interpretation of Romans 9 with those of the rest of the church?
Well, first I would push back and say that there's wide variety in Molinism. So it's not actually fair to say that there's a Molinistic view, because, you can have an SBC traditionalist that's a Molinist, you can have an Arminian that's a Molinist, and what a lot of people don't realize, and some Molinists do, and they think this is like a gotcha moment, is Molina interpreted this passage the way that I'm interpreting this passage. So Molina didn't actually go to Romans 9 to try to demonstrate his case, at least not in this way. So he understood this as God being able to determine. He just worked in libertarian freedom elsewhere. So I don't think there is a Molinist. You'd have to give me, who am I talking about? Some of the alternate ways are things like that this is judicial hardening. This is dealing with the difference between the Jews, God's faithfulness to the Jews as opposed to the Gentiles. The problem with that, though, in dealing with the nations is that Paul sticks in this analogy from Pharaoh, right? Mm-hmm. No Jew at that time, right, would have objected to God judging Pharaoh for what he did. Right? No one would have stood up and said, "Wait a second. If Pharaoh freely chose to do the evil thing, then why are you punishing him for that?" Right? The Pharaoh example runs in the face of it being a comment about the judicial hardening of Israel and God's faithfulness for Israel and the expansion to the Gentiles. Especially, it's immediately after the Pharaoh example where God says, "I've raised up Pharaoh." Right? This isn't a good Jew that can't resist the will of God. This is Pharaoh who can't resist the will of God. Why does God still find fault with Pharaoh if he can't resist the will? That runs directly contrary to the idea of judicial hardening of the Jews.
Excellent. Gerard mentions that Mike Winger has a video that gives a non-reformed interpretation of Romans 9, and Reasonable Faith talks about Jerry Wall's video. I guess that is What's Wrong with Calvinism, number 4, I think. Let's do this as the last question. There's a lot of great questions in here, but we just can't get to them, and I got to get to this freestyle, and we wanted to keep this under 2 hours, which we are rapidly approaching. Although it's excellent, we still have got 80 people watching even now, and so that's
hanging in.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Troopers.
How would you deal with a Molinist interpretation or view of Romans 9? I think is a question I saw a lot of people ask, and I think that's probably going to be the last thing we can kind of get to. And then I'll let you offer whatever closing you want to, and then it's time for a freestyle.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to ask another question, because basically I don't know. You'd have to give me an example. You'd have to tell me which Molinist you're talking about. Is it an SBC traditionalist? Is it an Arminian? Is it, a Lutheran? Is it, what interpretation of Romans 9 are you actually getting at?
All right. Well, with that, give your summarized thoughts on the matter. Like why have you decided to tackle this? Are you just messing around? And like, why do you think it's important that you've invested time to understand this? Why have you done debates on this? Like kind of bring this to a head for everyone and kind of bring it back and let's help them again understand why we've even done this tonight. I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, largely because Molinism is not a small phenomenon. I mean, if you're anywhere in kind of apologetic circles, Molinism is rapidly becoming the predominant view, at least in kind of American Protestant evangelical circles. So, I mean, that might be narrowing it down too much, but it's becoming a major view. And as I've said before already, I think it's a very problematic view. Not only do I think it doesn't do, I don't think it does justice to the biblical text and to good systematic theology. I think it has very problematic entailments, which is why you get some Reformed folk who sound like they're being uncharitable because they confuse an entailment with the actual view itself. I don't want to do that. I want to separate those two, be charitable to the Molinist. Molinism isn't heresy, as we've said. Molinists aren't heretics. They're dear brothers in the Lord. But I think it has this logical entailment that opens it to open theism. And so I think it's a very problematic position.
Excellent. One more time, tell people what YouTube channel to subscribe to, maybe about the conference coming up here in Waco in the spring, as well as the blog and the podcast. Just one more time, because you got some great resources. Let people know how to find them.
Yeah, so if you go to freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com, you can find the Freed Thinker group page on Facebook. I'm part of a Mentionables ministry. The idea is that we are not your world famous apologists, but if you need resources, if you need speakers, if you want to have a conference at your church, we are some people that you could probably afford to bring out, and we're all over the country. And we have a conference coming up, the Mentionables second annual conference, held in Waco, Texas, at the end of March. The last weekend of March, we'll be out there. Some really great talks by Nick Peters, Joel Furchess, Mark Lambert. Clinton Wilcox is giving a breakout session on bioethics, which is going to be fantastic. I'm giving a talk on slavery in the Bible in the ancient Near Eastern context. And then I also have a debate with Aaron Ra, basically on the conflict thesis between science and religion. So there's going to be some great content on there.
Excellent stuff. All right, so you can stick around if you want, and here's what I'm going to do. You're not going to be able to hear the beat if you do stick around. I'm going to flip over to a screen where I've got a beat playing. I'm going to be able to hear it. You'll just hear me rapping if you stay around, or you can jump off Skype. It's up to you. But this is how we end it, because we got the super chat that was required thanks to Roxby as well as others. And what we're going to do is try to freestyle about some of these topics. It should be very, very interesting. It's kind of what we do. And we got some great people in the live chat. Much love to y'all. All right, so let me find which beat we're gonna use here. I think let's go with. Let me try this one and see how this one sounds, everybody. Do I want to do that one? No, let me try this one. Might want to try that one. I'm trying a few different ones. Let's see, I like to pick through beats sometimes. Depends on the mood. Let's see here. You know what? I might go with that one. All right, everybody. It is freestyle time here on Street Apologist. I'm going to switch over my cameras. Are you ready, ladies and gentlemen? Again, Tyler, I think you definitely killed it, man. Much love on everything.
Appreciate it.
And I could tell the people were definitely feeling it. Even those who disagreed seem like they're still cool, with everything. And guys, let me know what the volume level's here. And let me do one last thing. Where'd it go? I gotta get this all set up. Hold on. I'm gonna try to have it right before I start. Oh, there it is. Okay, excellent. All right, everybody. It's time to freestyle. It's going to be tricky because I'll be freestyling about philosophy stuff. Yo. Boom, bap, pow, like onomatopoeia. Discussing the concept by Louis Molina. He was Spanish. This beat will make the whack MCs leave and vanish. Yes, y'all, we did some damage to the concept called middle knowledge when it gets extended to something they teach everywhere now, even at Talbot College. Cause of WOC, I'm an MC. VOCAB MALONE, rapping because of Rock B. Gave the money, now the freestyle is free. Check it out now, philosophy and philosopher and theologian. I'm messing up my words when I'm spitting again, but it's all good, you can chill and lay low. Check out Tyler when he's in Waco, Texas. God knows what you eat for breakfast. He knows when you break up. He knows about your exes. He knows about the British doing the Brexit, and plus everything that's actual and the things that are not counterfactuals. Yes, y'all, every boy and girl, he knows all actual possible worlds. Possible, logically, prior, not chronological. We rock it, this is the story. Spock would like it, and so we had to write it. Paul, he write it. Romans, I ain't right beside it. How do you interpret the word? It's real, I don't know. Your exegetical skill may not match when you bring what you will. What I mean is free will is not determinative. Yes, y'all, you gotta learn, little kids. And so I rap. Check out Tyler's podcast. Check out his blog, The Dialogue with Eric H. And now you're like, what the H did he say? I know you'll feel that way. The topic can be hard and confusing. I hope you were tracking. I hope you're not losing. Yes, y'all, how we do today. Peep this out, it goes to back in the day. During the Reformation, they had to have a way to explain it away. So Molina say, I got the answer. It's kinda like a cancer. I ain't trying to diss. You're my friends, everybody that believes it. But please receive it. This healthy critique that we speak. We freak the beat, WOC, tied it to Tarek. I met Frank Tariq. I mean, how you say it. Okay, I'm full enough. Maybe I should end it, but this very show, it has been stupendous. Yes, y'all, I'm the one and the two. Shout out to Michelle and K-Dub True. We rock it, we do, we keep it friendly. Yes, y'all, and then we spin the counter-actual plus the counterfacts with these raps. Here we go again. 1, 2, 2. Please don't take a nap when we spit this knowledge. You can find it in your college or maybe seminary inside the library. The Only Wise God. That's a book you could read and then pick up one that go ahead and affirms the Westminster Creed. Please excuse me because I fell off the beat. All right, y'all. That's pretty much it. We're about to jam out. That was tricky because I'm like rapping philosophical stuff. I had a couple things I didn't get to. I wrote down a couple little topics I could get to. I got almost all of them. But here we are rapping about middle knowledge and all this. How you gonna do that? So I'm looking at the comments one last time. Much love to you guys. And let me tell you something while I've got 40 seconds left on this beat. This Saturday, I'm supposed to be debating an atheist. Gonna have a discussion, but we're gonna end up debating, I'm sure, on morality. So please check out the channel this Saturday, I think 9 o'clock East Coast. I'm also working on shows this Friday and this Sunday. So I plan on staying busy this weekend, and so I hope to see you guys around. I hope that even if you disagreed, you found today charitable, and much love to everyone. And now I'm going to switch out to the outro, and this has been a great show. Thanks again to you, my man, Tyler. Shalom, Street Apologist is out.
Turn your radio up. Whoa. Radio time. Whoa. You're now listening to Street Apologist. Street Apologist. Street Apologist. Street Apologist. On the radio. Street Apologist. Street Apologist. Street Apologist.